So our beginning text is Genesis 19:12. We will then skip over to Genesis 13:9. And our subject is when Lot lingered. Now in Genesis 19, verse 9 to 11, two angels show up in the town of Sodom, arriving at Abraham's nephew Lot's house. The town is in a riot. There's a crowd of men pounding at Lot's door, and they have a very immoral request. Lot goes outside the door, refuses their request. The crowd gets hostile, and the two angels who are inside the house, they pull Lot back into the house, shut the door, and then strike the men outside with blindness. That brings us to verse 12. The two men, that's the two angels, said to Lot, "Do you have anyone else here, sons-in-law, sons or daughters, or anyone else in the city who belongs to you? Get them out of here, because we are going to destroy this place. The outcry to the Lord against its people is so great that he has sent us to destroy it." So Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law who were pledged to be married to his daughters. He said, "Hurry, get out of this place, because the Lord is about to destroy this city." But his sons-in-law thought he was joking. With the coming of dawn, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Hurry, take your wife and your two daughters who are here, and you will be swept away when the city is punished." When he hesitated, the men, that's the angels, grasped his hands and the hands of his wife and of his two daughters and led them, that is, dragged them safely out of the city, for the Lord was merciful to them. As soon as they had brought them out, one of them said, "Flee for your lives. Don't look back and don't stop anywhere on the plain. Flee to the mountains or you will all be swept away." Now notice verse 16. When he hesitated. He hesitated to respond to God. The King James Version said he lingered. He lingered to the point that it would have cost him everything had divine hands not dragged him to safety. That's amazing. He hesitated. Now, this insight into his character as a man who, as a rule, would hesitate when God asked him to do something is really a fascinating study, and one that sadly relates to you and me. Well, first of all, let's establish Lot's spiritual condition. Now, on the surface, it looks like he's a lost person. Well, first of all, because you got a man here who, given the choice, chose to live in Sodom. No, well, maybe he didn't know that Sodom was such a bad place. Sodom had such a widespread reputation for being immoral that in Genesis 14:22 to 24, Abraham, who is offered the treasures of Sodom because he rescued the city, he refused to, and as he put it himself, take a shoelace if it comes from that city, arguing that I don't want it to be said that Sodom made me rich. Jared Thomas wrote, "But when Lot was given the choice of where he wanted to live, the eyes of his ambition coveted the prosperity that he thought Sodom would afford him." So on one hand, you've got Abraham who doesn't want any of Sodom's wealth, and you've got Lot over here who coveted it. Okay, so the first reason that it looks like Lot was a lost person was because you've got a man who, given the choice, wants to live in Sodom. But secondly, when God wanted to make his will to Lot so clear that he actually sent two angels to deliver his will, and the message was a matter of life and death, Lot still lingered. He hesitated to respond to God. Now, what kind of a person is this? And we're going to find out that this flesh-oriented, this self-centered, this worldling, what kind of person is this? Well, we might be quick to judge that he was an unrighteous, lost person, but it turns out the Bible makes it very clear that he was actually a saved person. He was a beloved child of God. It turns out that he's a perfect description of you and I. 1 Corinthians 10, 11, and 12, speaking of Old Testament characters who failed, which would definitely include Lot, it says, these things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the fulfillment of the ages has come. So if you think you're standing firm, that is, if you think I would never do that, you be careful that you don't fall. Okay, so now how do we know that he was saved? Well, first of all, because in Genesis 18, God promised Abraham that when he destroys Sodom, and I'll read it, he would not sweep the righteous away with the wicked. So that's why he had to get Lot out of the city. Genesis 19:22 is where one of the angels turns to Lot and says, but flee there quickly. He's talking about to the safe town of Zoar. And he says, because I cannot do anything until you reach it. God had to get Lot out of Sodom in order to keep his promise to Abraham that he wouldn't sweep away the righteous with the wicked. How do we know that he was saved? Number 2, 2 Peter 2, verse 7 to 9 ends all conjecture. It said, God rescued Lot, a righteous man. Now, you're thinking, wait a minute, how can you choose to live in Sodom and be a righteous person? It's because righteous here meant in right standing with God. He wasn't righteous in his behavior. He certainly wasn't righteous in his choices. But he was in right standing with God. Well, so how does a person get in right standing with God then? Well, from Genesis all the way through to Revelation, the only way you can possibly get in right standing with God is through faith. Romans chapter 1, verse 17 says, salvation is a righteousness that is by faith. Galatians 4:3 said, Abraham believed in God and it was credited to him as righteousness. So when a person repents and believes the gospel, they are not only forgiven, but they are declared righteous by God. Their sin debt has been erased. Not only that, but they're given a new nature, they're given a new heart. And this is a new heart that loves God and is grieved by sin. In fact, let me prove that this was the case for Lot in the passage that I just read in 2 Peter. For if God rescued Lot, a righteous man, and here it is, who was distressed by the filthy lives of the lawless men. For that righteous man living among them day after day was tormented in his righteous soul by the lawless deeds that he saw and heard. And if this is so, then the Lord knows how to rescue godly men from trials. So Lot is a person who made very bad choices, but God had given him a new heart. So let's say it again. Was Lot rescued because his ambitions and his choices were righteous? No. He was rescued because of God's amazing mercy, not because of his merit. Genesis 19:16 again. When he hesitated, the men, that's the angels, grasped him by the hand and the hands of his wife and the 2 of his daughters and led them to safety out of the city, I dare say kicking and screaming, for the Lord was merciful to them. That's mercy. That's not merit. So what's Lot's spiritual condition? He's a saved child of God that God rescued. Now let's look at Lot's lingering complacency. You see, he knew better than to hesitate to leave Sodom when God commanded him to. Why? Well, we just got through the first one, which is he knew and was appalled by the evil in Sodom. So he had very strong moral reasons for leaving the place. Well, secondly, what about the nature of the message that was delivered to him? Genesis 19:13, we're going to destroy this place. The outcry of the Lord against its people is so great that he sent us to destroy it. So he not only had moral reasons to flee, he had emotional reasons to flee. I mean, what about self-preservation? What about the preservation of his family? And then thirdly, Sodom had nearly cost him his life once before. He'd been nearly enslaved, along with all the other people of Sodom. In Genesis chapter 14, that you read about 3 kings who came and they captured Sodom and they took everyone away hostage. He would have died as a slave had it not been for the fact that Abraham showed up and heroically rescued him and the whole city. Isn't that a bit like us? How many times do believers just indulge in something that's nearly cost them everything? It's nearly cost them their family, yet they keep doing it. They keep hanging around in the vicinity of the temptation. And fourthly, he hesitated even though when he heard the message, we know that he actually believed it as well. Well, how do we know that he believed it? Verse 14, Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law who were pledged to be married to his daughters, and he said, hurry and get out of this place because the Lord is about to destroy this city. So he went with urgency to his sons-in-law to say, you need to get out. God's told me. They thought he was joking. So he believed the warning. He absolutely believed God, and yet he still didn't respond to him. He had to be dragged out of the city. He hesitated. So what is the explanation for this lingering? I want you to turn to Genesis chapter 13 and verse 9. And while you're doing that, let me just say that Abraham and his nephew Lot, they're traveling together. You probably know the story. And because both of them owned so much livestock, their workers started fighting with each other over who gets the best grazing land. Well, Abraham, being the senior, looks at the situation and he decides that the two of them need to part their ways. And astonishingly, he gives the first choice of land to his nephew Lot. Abraham says to Lot in verse 9, let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. Now look at verse 10. Lot looked up and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan was well watered like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt towards Zoar. This is before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out towards the east. And the two men parted company. Abraham lived in the land of Canaan, notice the promised land, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tent near Sodom. One's in the promised land, one's neighbors to Sodom. Well, what do we learn about Lot here? First of all, this is a guy that walked by sight and not by faith. Lot looked up and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan was well watered. He walked by sight and not by faith. But 2 Corinthians 5:7 says, no, we're to walk by faith and not by sight. Look, if you're walking only by your physical sight, what is the only thing you're going to see? It's going to be this world and its temptations. And that's all he saw. You find that's all he saw throughout the whole story. But in 1 John 2:16, we know that all that's in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life is not of the Father, but is of the world. So why did Lot hesitate? It's because all of his decisions were based on what looked good to him, not what looked good to God. So he walked by sight, not by faith. And because he did, he chose personal profit over God's pleasure. Look, Lot looked up and saw the whole plain of the Jordan was well watered. You know, don't those words just have a barb in them? Cause you to think about him? It says Lot looked up. But what did he look up to see? Lord, what is your opinion? Did he look up to see God? No. When he looked up, the only thing that he could see was material things. That is, specifically, the whole plain of the Jordan was really well watered. Meaning that this is the place where I could financially prosper. There's real potential here. Imagine, he was one of God's people, and yet his entire focus was on prospering himself, not pleasing God. Now, when you look up, what do you see? Lot looked up and saw potential profit. Genesis 3:6 says, Eve looked up and saw that the tree was good for food and desirable. Numbers 13:31 says, Israel looked up and saw there were giants in the land and they were discouraged. But all these people, when they're looking up, they're not seeing God. Lord, what's your opinion? They're just seeing what their eyes can see. Walking by physical sight is where you go through life making decisions because they're what you find attractive. You do that, you're headed for Sodom. Walking by faith is when you're making decisions on what I believe God finds attractive. You do that, you're headed for the promised land. He walked by sight, not by faith. He chose profit, personal profit over God's pleasure. And you notice that he is now operating by a perverted value system. Lot looked up and he saw the whole plain of the Jordan was well watered, like the garden of the Lord in the land of Egypt towards Zoar. Because he could only see with his physical eyes, you notice he looks at Sodom, and that looked to him exactly like the garden of the Lord. That looked to him exactly like the Garden of Eden. Now, listen, when you mistake Sodom for paradise, something is really wrong. With that value system, you're going to linger every time God asks you to do anything. He was not only operating on a perverted value system, but he's operating constantly out of self-interest, not out of righteousness. Lot looked up and saw the whole plain of the Jordan was well watered like the garden of the Lord, the land of Egypt towards Zoar. And look how God chooses his words. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan. He didn't choose for God's glory. He didn't choose for Abraham. He didn't choose for his family what would be best for them. He chose for himself. So do you see what Lot is doing here? Lot, though he's a child of God, he's just simply making the mistake of presuming he can run his own life because he's making all of his decisions without consulting God. Now, by contrast, Abraham wasn't like that at all. Genesis 13:3 and 4. From the Negev, Abraham went from place to place until he came to Bethel, where his tent had been earlier, and where he had first built an altar. There Abraham called on the name of the Lord. And you see, when you read the story of Abraham, you'll see that every single place he goes to, first thing he does is build an altar to God. 5 times we read of him stopping to build an altar. 4 times we read him stopping to inquire of the Lord. We never read that about Lot, ever. And why? Why wasn't he doing that? Didn't have to do it. He's making all his own decisions. Sounds a bit like us. Warren Wiersbe said Lot chose based on his own perception rather than God's guidance, and it nearly cost him everything. He's driven by self-interest, not righteousness. And you want to know something that's bizarre? It's almost explains everything else, is he had a very high view of himself spiritually. Genesis 13:12, Abraham lived near the land of Canaan. He went to the promised land, where Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tent near Sodom. He didn't pitch it in Sodom because that's a real bad place. But I'll be cool if I live near it. I can live near Sodom. I can live near temptation, and I'm going to be all right. I'm not going to fall for that stuff. This is a very high view of yourself. Proverbs 28:26 says, whoever trusted himself is a fool. 1 Corinthians 10:12, therefore, let anyone who thinks he will stand, I'd never do that, take heed lest he fall. Lot lingered because he thought that he could pitch his tent near Sodom and stay pure. But as we all know from Proverbs 16:18, pride cometh before the fall, and that's the very thing that happens, because the very next time we read about Lot is in Genesis 14:12, where we discover that Lot was now living in Sodom. And then you get to Genesis 19:1, where it says the 2 angels arrived in Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of the city. Now, that doesn't really communicate anything to us, but it communicates to the ancient Hebrew. It actually was saying something. Any scholar will tell you that when it says that he was sitting in the gateway of the city, this is the unique, specific place that the local magistrate, the local government met in that culture. So Lot has now become a high judge in the town of Sodom. This is supported by Genesis 14:9, where an angry crowd, speaking of Lot, says, this fellow came here as an alien, and now he wants to play the judge. So Lot pitches his tent near Sodom, inevitably winds up in Sodom, and his incurable ambition has resulted in becoming a leader in Sodom. Now, folks, if, like Lot, you're one of those people who craves to be desired by the world, applauded by the world, let me tell you this, when God calls you, you're going to be pretty slow to respond. Finally, notice the cost of being a lingerer. First thing you have to observe is that Lot's life made no difference in the life of those around him. Where do I get that from? Well, because in the Bible account, there was not one righteous person found in the entire city outside of his own family. So after years and years of living there, he never made any difference to anybody spiritually. He didn't seem to care less about lost souls. He just wanted to be a somebody. Now, Richard Knill, he's the guy who has a very interesting anecdote in his life, because he met Charles Spurgeon when Charles Spurgeon was a little boy. And do you know something that was recorded by the family? He picked up the boy, sat him on his knee, and then prophesied in front of the whole family, see this little kid? This kid is going to become a great preacher, a famous preacher that will influence the lives of millions of people. Well, this same Richard Knill, years later, was handing out gospel tracts to soldiers. When one of the soldiers, who obviously was an officer, he stopped him doing so by commanding the other soldiers to form a circle around him so that he couldn't pass out any more of them. Well, years after that, when Richard Knill was preaching on the streets, a soldier came up to him and he said, you remember the time when you were handing out tracts to soldiers and a soldier prevented you from doing that by ordering other soldiers to circle you? And Richard Knill said, I absolutely do. I absolutely do. How did you know that? Well, the soldier didn't answer the question. He just simply said, well, but do you remember what you did next? And Knill said, no, I have no idea what I did next. The soldier said, you burst into tears. Tears were flowing down your cheeks because you were so grieved that you couldn't tell us about Jesus. Well, I want you to know I was that soldier. I was the soldier that stopped you, and your grief cut me to the heart. So I had to go home and engage in some self-examination, some soul-searching. But now I want to tell you, sir, that I thought you should know that I now preach the same Jesus that you love and that I once despised. Lot, he didn't think that way. He didn't have a love for souls. He made no difference in the lives of those around him. In fact, he made very little difference in the lives of his own family, because as we read, his lifestyle was so different from any faith that he might have proclaimed that when he did proclaim faith, it carried very little weight. Because when he told his sons-in-law to flee the city, they thought he's joking. It didn't carry any weight. His sons-in-law perished. Genesis 19:15 says, the angels urged Lot, saying, hurry, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, indicating that there might have been other daughters who perished. Then we find out that his wife perished. The only people that survived was Lot and his 2 daughters. And the very next thing we read that those two daughters did is they got their dad stone drunk and committed incest with him. And they gave birth to two boys, and one was Moab, who was the leader of the Moabites, and the other was Ami, who became the leader of the Ammonites. You know why all this? Because Lot walked by sight and not by faith. Because he chose his personal profit over God's pleasure. Because of that, he ended up with a perverted value system that saw evil, that saw Sodom as paradise. His whole life was driven by self-interest, not righteousness, and yet for all of that, he has a high view of himself. He had a high view of himself spiritually. I could go near it, it wouldn't bother me. Folks, if like Lot, you linger when God calls you, that is, you serve God when it's convenient to you to do so, one day the angels are going to write your epitaph, and it will say, this life made no difference, because when called by God, like Lot, he lingered. May it not be so. Let's pray.